Grave goods are the things that people put in other people's coffins or graves when they die, knowing that they will almost certainly never get them back. And at this stage, a lot of people say, oh, well, I thought that was something they did in the ancient world. Do people really still do that today? And my answer is a resounding yes. To get a sense of the scale, I recently ran a nationwide representative survey through YouGov to get a sense of the percentages that we're talking in the UK at the moment. And it returned a figure of somewhere in the region of 53%. If you do the sums, that equates to about 350,000 funerals a year in the UK where some sort of grave good has a role. And these objects and items take all shapes and sizes. Believe me, I have seen pretty much everything at this point, but particularly common are flowers, letters, photos, food and drink, and items of clothing. So those are my top 5. Which is to say that grave goods are very much alive and well and around us today. We just don't really talk about them. In fact, it's quite often said that in the UK we have a bit of a problem with talking about death in general. We quite like avoiding it. And I think that needs to change, which is what my presentation today is designed to address. So I'm immensely grateful to the organisers for letting me come on board for lifting the lid, because the agenda for the festival is very much the same as mine, opening up those conversations around death and dying, lifting the lid on things that we'd maybe rather keep hidden if we had the choice. Now, of course, with grave goods, we are lifting that lid very literally as well as metaphorically. And this morning, or indeed this evening, tonight, my plan is to take you on a journey that mimics the one that I have been on myself as a death researcher. Because you simply cannot study death without it making an impression. And in my case, that journey has taken me to a point where I am really quite comfortable talking about death, apparently on a Saturday morning to an international audience. But a lot of people never get there. Now, don't get me wrong, that is not to say that the subjects of death and dying hold no fear or emotion for me. That's probably the opposite of the truth. I know precisely how significant and weighty and emotional these subjects are. But I have nevertheless reached a point where I think I can have important conversations that many people find very difficult. And at every step on today's journey, we're going to use grave goods as our focus. Because what I think grave goods offer us is the chance to focus on an object, on a specific item or a specific decision, which helps us to digest the otherwise huge topic of death and dying. So in that sense, I'm using grave goods as thinking tools. And my plan, if I've designed this session well, is that each stop will make us just slightly readier for the next. Each one will bring us slightly closer to the deaths which, rightly, frighten us the most and which we're least comfortable discussing. I've designed the journey to be interactive so that you can participate at home as little or as much as you want. That is in your control. You can play along entirely at your own pace, or you can look on without engaging. That is completely up to you. But know that I have tried to make it a light-hearted journey this morning. I hope light-hearted rather than silly. That can be a slightly difficult line to tread. But I believe quite firmly in 2 things. Firstly, that absolutely nobody likes listening to dry presentations by academics, including other academics. But secondly, and much more importantly, because if I have learned anything on my journey as a death researcher, It's that death can absolutely coexist alongside humour, alongside laughter, alongside joy, and alongside just a little bit of that silliness. And in fact, more than that, I think death really needs those things. It really helps us to face death by injecting a little bit of gentle levity. So forgive me entirely if I make you laugh or smile, and trust me when I say that it is absolutely fine to do both. Right, so let's kick off with step one on our journey, which today takes us to ancient Egypt. Now, if you were to write my origin story as a death researcher, ancient Egypt is where it probably began. I was 7. We were studying the ancient Egyptians in my year 3 class at school. And I absolutely fell in love, particularly with the way that the ancient Egyptians handled death. The mummies, the tombs, the canopic jars, the huge Book of the Dead, the afterlife, the pyramids. I almost wore my Book of the Dead t-shirt this morning in tribute, but it looked a little bit too much like pajamas. And given some of you are in the middle of the night, I erred away from that. But trust me when I say the ancient Egyptians knew how to make a big material ritual fuss about death and dying. Without realizing it, at the age of 7, I was taking the first small steps to what would become a career studying death and dying. And it never felt scary. It felt fascinating, which is why I'm going to take you there for our first stop on today's journey. Now, to help us to think about the grave goods that the ancient Egyptians picked, I've come up with a little game entirely plagiarized. You may know it as Kim's game. But for the purposes of this morning, I asked my husband to come up with some kind of Egyptian pun. So for today's game, it's not called Kim's game. We're playing Rememhotep. And if you think that's bad, I'm afraid it will continue to get worse. There are also, unfortunately, no prizes, but the rules are very simple. In a second, I'm going to change the slide and show you 11 examples of grave goods that have been found in ancient Egyptian burials. I'm going to give you 30 seconds, there or thereabouts, to memorize them before taking them away and giving you 1 minute to try and remember all 11. So there you are. You can have 30 seconds. So what we're looking at here is a scratch of papyrus scroll, an obelisk, a death mask roughly modelled on Tutankhamun's, an ankh, a canopic jar, a snake that looks maybe slightly more reminiscent of 2000s phone games than with ancient Egypt, but there we are. In the middle, we've got Anubis, god of death and dying, the human brain, famously removed through the nose when mummies were mummified, scarab beetles, which were placed over the heart as a totem of good luck, a very cute looking sphinx, and a cat. Right, I make that approximately a generous 30 seconds, so time to take them away and see how many of those you can remember inside a minute. And it feels like a very long time when suddenly you're sat in your own silence. I should have come up with some kind of fitting lift music to fill the gap, get the countdown clock right at the end. There we are. Equally, the courage to sit in silence is sometimes probably the most valuable skill you can have as an academic, because, my goodness, nothing prepares you for undergraduate seminars like being content with there being no noise around you. So, practice for me. Okay, there is your minute up. And you can mark your own scripts, as it were, to tell me how well you did at Rememhotep. But I hope that wasn't too scary. I hope it started to get you thinking about this whole business of burying things with the dead, what that looks like, and why people might or might not do it. And it deliberately did so in about as remote a way as possible. Many of these specific objects are unfamiliar to us, and the ancient Egyptians lived a very long time ago. There's deliberately a big buffer of time and distance. So, as we take our second step, let's close some of that distance. Let's make things a little bit more modern, bringing them up to the 20th century. This time, we're going to be playing a game of pairs. On the screen are 5 20th century celebrities. So we've got Elizabeth Taylor, JFK, Roald Dahl, Frank Sinatra, and Bob Marley. Below them are 5 grave goods. The task is simple. Can you pair the celebrity with the grave good that they were buried with? Again, I'm going to give you one excruciating quiet undergraduate minute to see how you get on matching the celebrities with their grave goods. So between these 5, we have a whale tooth, a bar of chocolate, love letter, a Bible, and a bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey. Whiskey? I don't really know my liquor. Oh, I may have just made a really big faux pas. Oh well, it's only being recorded on the national stage, it's fine. So yes, some of you might know, I will say that I pinched this question from the incredibly nerdy BBC game show Only Connect. So if you ever catch that rerun, you're very welcome. You'll have a massive advantage. Right, and to put you out of your misery, these are the answers. So, a love letter for Elizabeth Taylor. JFK was buried with a whale tooth. Roald Dahl was buried with a bar of chocolate. Frank Sinatra with a bottle of Jack Daniel's, and Bob Marley with a Bible. But I wonder how you're feeling now that that gap has just closed a little bit. I should imagine that these people are strangers to most of us, but they probably do feel that bit closer. We have photographs of them. They lived well within living memory. And these objects are also a bit more familiar, maybe excepting that whale tooth. Certainly in the interviews that I've done with my study, I've encountered all of these in real life very recently. And then I wonder how you found that act of matching. I'm hoping that it started to get you thinking about how different grave goods fit with different people. Because it makes a kind of sense that Roald Dahl, author of Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory, would have a chocolate bar. It makes a kind of sense that Elizabeth Taylor might be buried with a love letter, or 5 perhaps. Each of these objects captures a little part of the person's identity, their legacy, their personality, and their relationships. The whale tooth was, I believe, a gift from JFK's wife. And actually, that's a huge part of what grave goods do in the contemporary context. They're used to make somebody's final goodbye unique as them, capturing the unique impact that that person had. And that's become a hugely important thing for us in a great number of contexts across the world, but including contemporary Britain. When we plan funerals, we want them to be personal. We want them to show that this was somebody specific who meant something specific to us. And grave goods can absolutely be part of that. Now, for our next step, we are sticking with famous people, but looking a little bit more recently still. And this time we're going for a death that I suspect nobody here could have missed, by thinking about Queen Elizabeth II. Now, you might be thinking that there is surely nothing more to learn about the Queen's death in 2022. Everything about her funeral was broadcast widely and in minute detail. But for me, at least, there was one glaring omission. Nobody was telling me what was inside the Queen's coffin. Now, shockingly, that doesn't seem to be bothering anybody else, whereas I'm still weighing up the relative merits of writing to the Crown to ask for a freedom of information request, but at the risk that I might be put on some kind of list. But there is a good chance I'm about to be put on a list anyway for what I'm about to do. So, introducing on your Saturday morning, evening, night, Queen's Coffin Tinder. Now, the game, if you can call Tinder a game, is very simple. I have picked out some potential queenly grave goods, and for each one, you get to decide whether you would swipe left for no, don't think that one, or swipe right for yes. Now, I will say my attempts at animation was short-lived, so I'm afraid it is static. You'll have to use your imaginations. But yeah, picture yourself there on your mobile phone, sifting through the Queen's potential grave goods. Starting with a handbag. Whenever she was on a public engagement, Queen Elizabeth famously carried a small black leather handbag. Would you pop one in her coffin alongside her? And then secondly, a stamp. Now, a stamp isn't huge. It seems quite fitting. Literally has her all over it. And it's a marker, surely, of her long reign, her ubiquitous presence and profile. Do you think that a stamp might make a fitting royal grave goods? Thirdly, some letters. Now, as I've mentioned, the act of writing to the dead is something that we see quite a lot. For some people, those are long letters. For other people, it's often quite a last-minute decision, a heartfelt note, even a quick postcard. Very few of those letters get read, which I think is a tiny little bit magical. And certainly they're a way of expressing love, maybe expressing things that you never quite got to say in life, expressing unspoken truths. Now, the Queen will have written and received thousands upon thousands of letters in her lifetime. I wonder if you think any of her nearest and dearest took a chance to write one last time, then pop the missive in her coffin. Fourth, royal jewellery. Now, I try very hard not to speak for anyone else when I'm doing my research, but for the purposes of disclosure, I draw the line roughly here. Surely something so valuable, so historic, shouldn't be squirreled away in a grave. But then, a great many people are buried or cremated with jewellery. And sometimes that jewellery is incredibly valuable, whether financially or sentimentally. And actually, who's to say there wasn't something small that the Queen particularly treasured that might still be about her person in the crypt of St. George's? Number 5, nail varnish. Supposedly, the Queen was rarely seen without a very specific shade of Essie nude nail varnish. Is that something that you would carry on in death? Or does it maybe seem just a little bit pointless? Surely it doesn't matter if the dead have neatly manicured nails. And then sixthly and finally, champagne. Another of the Queen's day-to-day realities, apparently she would have a small glass every day. And plenty of people do say that they might like to have food and drink, and particularly luxury or favourite foods and drinks with them. A kind of best bit of life's smorgasbord. So what about popping a bottle of champagne in Liz's coffin to keep her company? Now, I don't know which, if any, of these objects you think would make good grave goods for a queen. But I do know that with this step on our journey, we've not only closed the gap of time a little more still, and the gap of familiarity, we've also introduced just a little bit of gentle decision-making. You are starting to think about the reality of burying or not burying specific items. You're weighing up the objects and their meanings and their significance, as well as their function, and that question of whether or not they are better off in the land of the living. And you might just be starting to think about the point of this, of any of this, and you wouldn't be alone in that. When I ran that survey with YouGov, I had plenty of people, mostly politely, express their incredulity, saying roughly, what on earth is the point? They are dead. I don't begrudge them that. I do begrudge the person who said that I deserve to be turned into a grave good for running this survey. If that was you, I will be writing sternly. But there is certainly a level on which grave goods are a bit bonkers. And that's especially true in a context like the contemporary UK, where either most people don't believe in an afterlife, or if they do, it's not one where you're able to take anything with you. And yet, here we are. So many people, nevertheless, find grave goods meaningful, including people like John and Jane, who are step 4 on this morning's journey. I'm going to briefly introduce you to John and Jane, along with some other members of their family. So Jane recently lost her dad, John, quite unexpectedly at the relatively tender age of 71. In life, John loved fishing and could reliably be found wearing his anorak and disreputable hat, snuggled in a blanket, sipping tea from a thermos at the side of a lake. He used to take Jane sometimes, as well as her son, Fred. Now, don't get me wrong, Jane hated fishing, but she really loved spending time with her dad and her son. Before John retired, he was a military man, a submariner in the Navy who took on primarily onshore duties when Jane started secondary school. The family found that it was less disruptive. They weren't always moving around. But John loved the Navy, kept his uniform in pristine condition, and always brought it out on Remembrance Day, and sometimes for weddings. Now, John's wife, Debbie, who's in the top corner there, also died quite young, a few years ago, leaving John a widow after almost 40 years of marriage. And John missed Debbie tremendously, keeping photographs of her on his bedside table and in his wallet. John was also in regular contact with his younger sister, Fiona, and his older brother, James. James, like John, had been in the military, part of a long tradition going back generations of their family of belonging to the armed forces. Now, neither John nor Jane particularly belong to a religion. They've never really thought or talked about what they think happens when somebody dies. But Fiona, on the end there, is a spiritualist. And as a spiritualist, she believes that for some time after death, the dead don't pass on, but hover between worlds and can therefore see their funerals and the way that their body is prepared. As John's only child, Jane is left making decisions about her dad's funeral. John didn't give much indication of what he wanted to happen with his body or for his funeral, but Jane decides that it might be nice for her dad to have a natural burial. She likes that that's an environmentally conscious choice, and there's a natural burial site not far from John's house where there's a small lake. It seems like a fitting nod to those wonderful memories of spending time at the lakeside with her dad. She also thinks it might be quite a nice place to visit. But that's not the only decision that Jane needs to make. The funeral director encourages her to think about what she might like her dad to wear and whether there's anything else she might put in the coffin. The funeral director encourages her to discuss it with other members of the family. Now, my question is this. If you were Jane, what, if any, grave goods might you pick out? What might you pick for John to wear? And what, if anything, might make you hesitate? Well, John isn't somebody you know. In fact, he's not real. He's a portmanteau of many of the different stories I've been told during this piece of research. But I think he'll probably have some kind of familiarity. Perhaps he's the sort of person you might know. He's got passions and relationships, interests and preferences. And so you can start making decisions about what might or might not be fitting for him. And by doing that, you can practice thinking about relating grave goods to a specific person from a blank slate to plan one of those personal funerals. Ideally, given the natural burial site chosen in this story, one that doesn't do any harm to the environment. You might also find that John's story is familiar because there are quite a lot of people in play. Funerals are, in the UK, typically and technically delivered to one single client, but that doesn't mean that they are organised by one person. And funerals are often the product of good-natured families coming together in grief, but that isn't always the case. Funerals can be fraught and complicated and resounding with disagreement, including up to the point of digging up a freshly buried body to retrieve some controversial grave goods that people couldn't agree on. Although I will stress that that has so far only happened once in my research travels. Now, step 5, and things are going to get a little bit real and a little bit closer to home. And if you thought that Queen Elizabeth's coffin tinder was an exciting detour for a Saturday morning, buckle up for what's next, because for this stop on our journey, I am taking you to London's Vagina Museum. Bear with me. The Vagina Museum in London's Bethnal Green recently hosted an exhibition called The Museum of Mankind. And it explored the ways that historic grave goods have been interpreted, perhaps misinterpreted, and by extension, the way that future grave goods might be subject to the same. In response, visitors were invited to contribute to a huge ceiling-to-floor display of drawings, all labelled Your Grave Goods. They were provided a template like the one that you see on the screen here and encouraged to draw what they might like to be buried with, reflecting on how those objects, quote, told the story of you. So, needless to say, the second I heard that these drawings existed, I was emailing the museum faster than the speed of light, and we organised for me to take custody of the drawings at the end of the exhibition, all 1,800 of them. And I spent very many happy hours working through each and every one, cataloguing their contents. And the top 10 grave goods that featured in these drawings were, in order, clothes and shoes, jewellery and watches, food and drink, tied with electronics and tech. The number of mobile phones and pairs of headphones was astonishing. Pets, music, books and literature, soft toys and teddies, sex-related objects, it is, after all, the Vagina Museum, flowers and plants, and pictures of people. And the reason I enjoyed documenting these so much is because so many of them were so funny. The whole space was, of course, a satirical setup, and that satire seeped into the contributions from the public, shaping their tone and contents. At least I think they did, because I really don't think quite that many people want to be buried with their sex toys or their living partners. But, I'm not here to judge, I'm here to learn. But it introduced me to another really important buffer that we can add into our conversations about death and dying. Even as you are thinking about something incredibly close to home, the prospect of your own mortality, there are no rules that say that you have to do so with a very serious and singularly sombre constitution. None at all. You are allowed to laugh. You are allowed to dream up the most preposterous possible grave goods without worrying about whether or not that would technically be allowed. My husband always jokes about popcorn kernels, which are definitely any crematorium that I've spoken to would frown upon. And back in September 2024, I did a comedy set all about grave goods and dressing the dead. And I promise that I wasn't the only one in that auditorium laughing. Although I did laugh because what a fun thing to get to do as part of my job. But injecting that levity is such an important ingredient as you start to grapple with the idea of death and dying as it applies to you. And I think that anything that we can do to facilitate that conversation, those thoughts, is a bonus. Because by introducing yourself to that topic, getting used to having it in your life as well as in your darker moments, it might just mean that gradually you get to a point where you can actually start concretizing your wishes. Those might be specific wishes for grave goods. They might be broader plans for your funeral. They might be written up in a legal formal document. They might be scribbled on a napkin. They might be just in the realm of conversation. But they're important. And they're important because practically no one I have ever spoken to has regretted being told what a loved one wanted before they passed. So many people have told me how utterly relieved and grateful they were when they realised that their relative had planned even some aspect of their funeral or memorial. It is nothing short of a gift to be able to leave behind some sense of direction. So, gently, and using whatever humour works for you, start using that template to think about what you might want in your coffin, in the hope that you'll reach a point when you can communicate it. And then, step 6, our final destination this morning. And I'm cheating a little bit because in an ideal world, you'd never reach this destination. Our final destination is thinking about the death of somebody we love. In many ways, that is a weightier decision than one's own death. Death rituals are never just about the dead, they are for the living. And it's almost always the living who make decisions. According to that survey that I ran, just 3% of people in the UK set out their wishes for their grave goods. That leaves huge chunks of the population planning funerals where they don't know what, if anything, that person might have wanted in their coffin. And yet the timeframes within which funerals need to be planned are often quite snug. And they happen at precisely the same time that grief is most clouding your vision. If you speak with funeral directors, as I regularly do, they'll tell you that people take in less than 10% of the information that they pass on when they first meet a grieving family. Grief literally renders us at a fraction of our full decision-making capacity, and yet there you are, making decisions that are often incredibly important, financially weighty, and where you've only got one shot. And so the trick lies in avoiding this final destination by thinking and talking about grave goods and all that go with them before you have to. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that those thoughts and those conversations might not be difficult. One of the survey respondents said that being asked to think about what she might hypothetically put in her husband's coffin had made her cry, which in turn made me cry, because I do care very deeply about striking the right balance between taking death seriously and recognizing that it's scary. And I don't always get that balance right, and certainly not for everybody. But I do believe that there are ways to make these decisions softer. Just as we've added different buffers on the grave goods journey today, you can add buffers. That might be the comfort of a cup of tea or coffee or wine or something stronger. It might be using a light-hearted tone. It might be starting with some of those weirder and wackier examples of grave goods that I've spoken about today to just spark a conversation that could grow into something meaningful. But I really do encourage you to introduce that buffer of time. Because by the time you get to the final destination, or even a stop before it following a difficult diagnosis, you are no longer necessarily in that best frame of mind to think about what is right or what you want or need to do. And it's a curious blend of life and work that I have spent so much time thinking about death and dying at what I like to think is a relatively tender age. But I have, and I'm so pleased that I have, because I consistently find that these are conversations that people desperately want to have. So go and have them. Think about those different steps that we've worked through today, and think about how you might use grave goods to spark a conversation yourself. Now that brings us to the end of our grave goods journey, and broadly to the end of my workshop. And I really hope it's been interesting and that I should have a little bit of time left for questions. I look like I've done okay, although you are always welcome to get in touch by email. I love nothing more than hearing from people who've found grave goods a stimulating topic. Now I've been focusing on the UK context today because that's my context, but I both expect and hope that these ideas will have resonated in other places. So if you are joining from elsewhere in the world and it strikes a chord, please get in touch. I would love to know. And wherever you've joined from today, if you do have feedback or questions or ideas about how I can use this better, develop it further, I would love to hear from you. My email address is there, and that's my research Instagram page. That QR code takes you to my research website. That research website is full of all sorts of things. I'm constantly adding to it. It currently looks a little bit like this. I might particularly encourage you to watch that TED Talk that Victoria kindly introduced earlier. I did that a year ago now, and it's just one of the best things I've ever done. I had such a glorious time doing it. There is also a page where I have a few podcast recordings, including the very lovely Jess May's opening ceremony podcast, which I know she shared ahead of this session this morning. And that webpage also includes a spot where you can find out more about how to get involved in my project via the research interviews that I'm still doing. I'm afraid this is limited to people either in or with a connection to the UK, but I do have just a few more slots for 45-minute interviews. So whether you're somebody who has picked out grave goods for someone they've lost, or you're a professional or a volunteer with grave goods experience, as it were, I'd particularly love to have that conversation. At this stage of my project, it's particularly important to me that I'm including diverse voices as well. So if you consider yourself to belong to any kind of UK minority, religious or ethnic or sexual or disability or anything else, I'd particularly love to hear from you. But for now, you have had 40 minutes of me talking albeit with those lovely 1-minute silences built in. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm hoping that we'll have some wonderful questions in the chat. Right, there we go.
Thank you, Jennifer, that's amazing. Really, yeah, there's lots of comments and questions, and
Good.
everyone's.
I will let you
I'll just
facilitate them for me.
So this is a comment or a sharing a moment. Katie and Lindsay have said we buried our dad with his 1950s copy of Just William. Just William's a UK book. Yeah, it's a novel if it's not known around the world, and his raggedy, trusty copy of Rough Guide to Spain. Our mum made a tiny pillow for his head to rest on, and I covered this in the sheepskin lining of my 2-year-old's pushchair. It was a quiet, intimate, therapeutic ritual. Dad had a green burial, so he only included natural materials that would decay. So it's lovely. That sort of, there was another comment, I think someone has said, well, there was a question about, there's a couple of questions. One of them was, here we go. Haley West says, it sort of leads on, I suppose, because discouraging, but allowing families to place items that aren't biodegradable into a natural burial plot. What does this conversation look like?
That's such a good question. And this is a conversation I've had with a couple of people who manage natural burial sites. And it's a conversation of two halves. So I think usually people who have picked a natural burial site have done so for a reason. And so usually people are really open to the idea that it's not just a kind of a free-for-all, if you like. There are some rules, there are some sensible parameters. What I've found from my research is that most people don't plan funerals with the environment at the top of their agenda. They've got other things on their mind, but that they are nevertheless very open to having that kind of, okay, what about the environment conversation? So yeah, audiences tend to be receptive, albeit that I think the onus remains very heavily on the death professional to guide that conversation, which, you know, I don't underestimate. I think the amount of soft people, emotional processing skills that funeral professionals show is astonishing. I couldn't do it, certainly. The other half of that conversation, I like to quote a woman that I interviewed who owns a natural burial site, who quite simply put it as, it's not like I can go digging it up to check, which is tricky. But there are laws governing that apart from anything else. But I think it speaks to the fact that the boundary is a little bit flexible. So the conversation I had with this woman was, you know, if I knew that there were, you know, plastic toys or lots of kind of heavily varnished wood in there, I might step in and do something. But a wedding ring, is that going to biodegrade? No. But is it going to cause a huge amount of damage? Also probably not. So these boundaries are flexible. I think these conversations are going to keep happening more and more as the kind of green agenda becomes more prominent in funerals, as it absolutely should. But yeah, there's a little bit of kind of subtlety and difficulty there that relies on what I see absolutely everywhere doing this research, which is incredible people going into death work and being gentle, but sharing their expertise with the people who consult them. That's a waffly answer, but yeah, I can't go digging them up is my my strap line for it.
And that sort of leads on to Jane Anderson, funeral celebrant, said, this is fascinating. May I ask if grave goods are more common in burials than cremations?
The answer is no. It seems to hold whether or not they're being buried or cremated. So the difference between burial and cremation is that there are more rules around cremation. So burial, at least conventional burial, you know, it's not quite, the rules are, there are no rules. But there's nothing stopping you from putting in broadly anything that you want that's not going to cause toxic damage to the soil. With cremation, there are rules, but again, the work that death professionals do to kind of say, right, we can't have explosives, we can't have ideally things made of rubber, so rubber-soled shoes are out, ideally nothing made of glass, ideally nothing that's going to cause a hot spot. So I once had a very, very good conversation about how to cremate a potato. Turns out you just have to prick holes in it, like you would if you were making a baked potato. But the funeral directors that I've tended to speak to, and people who run crematoria, are very good at saying, right, we don't want to set fire to fire retardant clothing, for example. Is there another way that you could incorporate this person's kind of biking clothing if they were really into their kind of motorbikes and things like that? Or, okay, this photograph has a plastic film on it. Ideally, we wouldn't cremate something that's going to cause those that carbon release. Why don't we print it out on non-plastic paper? Or if if it's a particular kind of perfume, rather than popping that glass bottle in, why don't we find a way of incorporating the scent without the glass? Sometimes people will, if you're cremated in the UK, we have a peculiarly low level of law around what you can do with cremated remains. I know I've spoken to people in Central Europe who kind of look at me in horror when I say that people just go and scatter ashes pretty well wherever they want, which is broadly true. But you can still have ashes interred, so buried in an urn, and you can always put things in the urn at the same time. So that's a slight cheating, I suppose. Is it a grave good if it doesn't actually get cremated with it? I think it is. So I know quite a lot of people who inter sets of ashes together, so married couples or family members, and then pop a few items alongside them at the same time. But no, burial and cremation both seem to the guiding factor seems to be whether or not someone thinks this is a sensible thing to do, whether or not this is something that holds meaning for them, and much less to do with the, I suppose, logistics and the not quite legal regulatory frameworks.
Thank you. They just kind of, in cremation, just batter. It's the explosion thing, isn't it? Battery.
Absolutely. So anything that's going to damage the cremator. Glass apparently is a real bugbear, because a lot of people think like glasses, they don't think, goodness, that obviously has glass in. But I've seen pictures of kind of what can happen to a cremator, and it's just it's a lot of headache to get it clean again, basically.
Thank you. It's just so Elizabeth Jane Lovely said, I think it was Helen Frisbee who talked about death socks, special socks for the person to wear. That's something that I find something very tender about that. So
tender is such a lovely word for it. Yes. I love Helen Frisbee. She's a marvelous researcher. When I grow up, I want to be just like Helen. But she's absolutely right. People sometimes buy specific kind of death socks, or I know one woman who went out and bought her husband new pants because it was really important to her. But this urge to keep someone cozy and safe and warm is a really common theme. So blankets. I think Katie and Lindsay's example of that gorgeous piece of sheepskin. There are some absolutely beautiful examples, and some of it's sometimes people will sit there and go, oh, I know it's completely irrational, like this doesn't make sense, why would I be worried about them being cold? But just because that person has died doesn't mean that relationship of caregiving has disappeared. And so actually that urge to keep people cozy absolutely persists, and warm dry socks, spare clothes, blankets, caps, familiar fleeces. I've seen all of them, and I think they're beautiful. Yeah.
I was going to say people, because where I work at funeral directors, sometimes people say they're sort of, if something's a well-worn piece of clothes, they're sometimes embarrassed, and I'm like, don't be embarrassed. That shows that it's really means something.
It says objects that cease to make sense without the person as well. My dad is infamous for wearing a incredibly ugly red fleece. Sorry, Dad, if you see this recorded, it's great. We love your fleece. But he's always, his entire life that I've remembered, had a red fleece on the go. And it just wouldn't make sense for him to not have it, but also wouldn't make sense for it to exist without him. And so, yeah, I think, hopefully it's many, many years away. But when it comes, I don't think I'm going to hesitate. Red fleece it is, absolutely.
Exactly. So this is actually it's more of a question dilemma. Leaf Lovejoy. If something goes into the grave, it's usually, barring disinterment or exhumation, no longer physically available to descendants as a tangible legacy. Although this might remain available to future grave researchers, but a photo won't last in a grave, although microfilm might endure. Dilemma as to what.
Yes, and all of these things factor into people's decision making. And funeral directors that I've worked with have always said, if there's any doubt, don't bury it, because it's not going to last forever, and it will be tricky to get it back. I have had a few kind of hair-raising stories of exhumation orders, and occasionally that's an exhumation order to actually put something in that they regretted not putting in, rather than to pull something out that they regretted putting in. One of the best questions I've ever been asked off the back of a presentation was, what do you think archaeologists are going to find in a few hundred years' time that really baffles them in our graves? And my favourite example for this, and I'm about to show my age, is iPods. So I reckon there will have been a period of maybe just 10 years where loads of people were buried with iPods. Certainly loads of people want to be buried now with mobile phones, with headphones, things like this. But iPods was such a kind of, really, in the grand scheme of things, a short-term phenomenon, just a thing just for music. And I think that it could be very easy to lose track in the historical record of what on earth we were doing with them. So I like to think that the iPod is really going to confound a future archaeologist. I also like the people who come in and say, bury me with something from the Stone Age, because then it will really confuse the archaeologist, because nothing will make sense. I mean, I don't know who has access to Stone Age remnants, but if you do, please, by all means, go ahead, give the academics of the future something to really cross their brows over. All these things go into the decision making, and this is why sometimes my job is just such fun, because people are sat there, coming up with all these silly ideas as to, how can I confound people like you in the future? And I'm like, you know what? As long as it makes sense to you, and it's not doing any harm, you go ahead.